Okay, the button has been pressed. Here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Who are you? Have we met before? If not, welcome to you. If we have, what's going on? Thanks to everyone for being here. Feels like old times for me, y'all, this week. You see, for many years, I recorded these intros and outros at the same time every week. Late night on either Friday or Saturday night. I try to do it on Friday, but sometimes I'd be a little too tired, and I would do it on Saturday. Longtime listeners might remember, I used to talk about that all the time. It's late, and I got to get this done, right? Well, some while back, I decided that recording the intros and outros late at night was maybe not the best idea. I just felt like sometimes I was a little loopy and the intros and outros are a little fast and loose, if you know what I mean. So I started recording on Sunday morning or afternoon instead, when my energy feels a lot more clear. But not this week. It is late night on Saturday, just like old times. The reason being that tomorrow is my wife Audrey's birthday. And me and my two daughters decided that because my wife basically does everything for all of us in this house all year round, that tomorrow on her birthday, we are going to do everything for her. So we're going to make her breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and clean, and she gets to do whatever she wants. We are going to pamper her on her birthday, and I need to be available for that. So we got to make this happen now. And I got to admit, I'm pretty toast. It's been a pretty long week. It's been a good week, but it was a long week. Got the teacher training kicked off. Shout out to all of you who are participating. It was a great week, but it was a lot. I did a lot this week, y'all. And I'm a little bit tired, but it's not going to stop me from being there for my wife tomorrow because she deserves it. And I've certainly said it before, but I'm going to take this moment to say again. I love my wife, Audrey, so much. I don't even have proper words to express it. She is by far the most sensitive and honest person I've ever met in my life. I'm so profoundly grateful that she has chosen to be with me. I love you very much, Audrey. Happy birthday to you. See, I'm a little bit loopy. It's late, but it's okay. Sometimes, you just gotta roll with it, right? It is whatever it is. And that is good enough. I am very happy to be bringing you a conversation today with another old friend. And I know I've been doing this for several weeks now, where it's people from other times in my life who I'm reconnecting with after many years. And it's certainly the case with my guest today, Taran Rosenthal. And I really can't explain why Taran came to my mind. It was a very random occurrence that his name flashed across one of my feeds, and I thought to check out what he was doing, and turns out he's doing Chinese medicine. And Taran was a very significant person in my life, even though I don't think he knew that at the time. I talk all about this at the very beginning. You'll hear I explain to him and you why he was significant to me. But I really didn't have a clear idea as to why I would be talking to Taran now after all these years. But when I got on the call with him, it made a lot of sense. If you've been around, you know all these conversations I've been having with my old friends, I think they're all pieces of a larger conversation I'm having. Maybe you know what I mean, if you've been around listening some. And I think that my conversation with Taran was more nuance to these questions I've been asking about energy and matter and consciousness and spirit and materialism. And he had an interesting perspective that brought some new elements to it that were interesting to me. And it was just super fun to reconnect with him after all of these years. I'm very glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick, before we get to that, I do want to just take a moment to express gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. Today, I want to specifically say thank you to Lynn Pompeo and Morton Ronning. Thank you, Lynn and Morton. Appreciate you supporting us through your subscription. And if you're new around here and you want to have access to the full archives or also be a supporting listener, the way to do it is a podcast premium subscription. It's choose your rate. You cancel at any time. We always like to mention that if you don't have any money right now and you want to get to those old episodes, if you email us, we will be very happy to give you a free account. No questions asked. But if you can afford to give a little bit of something, even as little as $5 a month, then you really will be helping us to continue doing this show as we have been. And we're very grateful to all of you. So if you want to find out more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, or if you want to find out about all of my other stuff, I've got live stream classes and ongoing teacher sangha and other stuff that you are very welcome to participate in. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think we'll just leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Taran Rosenthal. Hello?
What's up, Jay?
Taran! What a trip!
No doubt, brother.
So amazing to hear your voice after, I believe it's been something like 28 years.
Sounds about right. I'll trust that your calculations are spot on. Not my strong suit, so.
I don't know how spot on they are, but I looked at a calendar just earlier today to see if I could try to figure it out.
Yeah.
And as far as I could, it's been something like that. And I was amazed. And so thanks for, taking up the invitation and giving me some of your time today. And I appreciate that you would do that.
Oh, it's my pleasure, man. I appreciate you reaching out. It was, sort of a fortuitous and fascinating missive from the depths. So I always like shit like that.
I love the way you put it, a missive from the depths. I like that because, maybe this is a good way. And just to mention, I'm already recording. I can consider us having started. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. I had a feeling you wouldn't mind the improvisatory nature of this show.
Not a bit.
Well, what I was going to say is I thought as a little bit of an introduction for anyone else who might listen to this, and as just an opportunity for me to say something to you that I wasn't able to say to you 28 years ago. And as I think the primary reason why I reached out to you, I don't know that you would have any sense of the sort of like indelible mark that you had as a person on me when we met back then. Specifically, we did that show together, Distortion Taco.
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Oh, vividly.
And, I remember that show, and a lot of my character almost never spoke. My character didn't really use words a lot. And I don't even know if you could call it a character, though. You see, that's the thing. That show was I don't even know you could call it a show or a dance, because it was so method interwoven with who we were as people and what we were dealing with at the time.
Yeah.
And I just recall, like, we had some improvisation movement explorations together that were like the most intimacy I had ever had with another man.
Mm.
And I think it was, and actually, I think some of those dances actually did have kind of like in the characters of the show, like a vaguely sexual component, but in the somatic experience of it, for me, it wasn't about sex. It was right. About this like sensitivity and deep intimacy with another man that was only capable for me, I think, because it was so nonverbal. Like, I don't even remember us even talking about it very much at all. It was all just us doing these like contact jams and stuff, you know?
Yeah.
So you just were somebody at that time who was already rooted in some things that I was yet to become more rooted in. I even remember, as an aside, like it was lunch one day over there at ETW, and I was just starting to like really feel things and feel like I didn't like eating meat so much anymore. And it wasn't like political at all. It's just I didn't, like, if I ate the chicken dinner at lunch, I couldn't get through the afternoon movement classes good, you know?
Right.
And I walked in and you were eating like beans and rice from that Mexican place across the street on Broadway.
Totally. What was the name of that place, man? The Cuban, it was like the sort
fusion. It was a fusion place.
Yeah, like a Chino Latino, but as opposed to being like a diner over on the west side, it was sort of I can't remember what it's called, but I totally remember they had that like
it was
amazing bread, and then you could either get black or pinto beans and rice. I think it was like $5.
Yeah. You could just get like a side of the black beans and rice, and it was like a meal. And so that like became my daily meal. So I say all that because you really did kind of have this impact and influence on me. And then, to this phrase you used, missive of depth or whatever, like I recently have been exploring, and people who listen to this show know, I don't know how to even say it, like calling out for spirit or inviting spirit maybe is the way, or letting things be a little bit more animate. I don't know how to say it really, but I like the way that I heard you say it a couple of times, where you're talking about singing out, right? Yeah. And having a song sung back to you. Yeah. That's right. That's the way landed really well landed with me in a way that felt really good. Well, I think of it because song and singing seems to communicate in that more poetry way, like movement. And so I think of the call that I'm putting out there, it feels more like a song than some kind of like email I'm sending out, And I definitely felt like the universe put you back into my radar when I was doing that, because you're out there working in healing modalities that seem to me to be related. And then I just like saw like a post of yours and that you had this podcast and stuff you were doing. And I said, oh my God, Taran is on this wavelength, but from like a different vantage point. So I reached out and here we are. Super cool. Yeah. So I guess just to catch up a little bit, last I remember seeing you, it was like 93 or 94 at ETW. Did you graduate the year before me or the same year as me or the year after? I can't even remember. I never graduated. I bounced and went and studied at the New York Dance Intensive with Francis Becker and Nina Martin for a while. Oh, right. And then, sort of like as somebody who my strengths were in the emergent end of the movement spectrum, meaning I was a solid improviser, but not great at digesting
128 counts of choreography. I tried to kind of like make a go of it in the professional scene in New York, and really wasn't that kind of a dancer. Like I couldn't keep up with the folks from the conservatories. So I left and, sort of just had this walkabout, so to speak. I went to Atlanta. I studied bodywork and massage therapy. I ended up in San Francisco for a while, doing some body work and working in kitchens and, just sort of like being in my early 20s in San Francisco. And eventually ended up deciding that I wanted to finish my degree and landed at Naropa when it was still Naropa Institute before it became Naropa University, and thought that I was going to do this BA to MA program in dance movement therapy, somatic psychology. But there was this, so in that world at the time, there were kind of like two major orientations to the work. One was, if we're dealing with the body, we have to have physical contact as part of that investigation, which as a body worker, of course, made total sense to me. And then the other was coming more from the psychotherapeutic end, was like, you never touch the body. And primarily, my interpretation of that was always that those concerns were really about the fact that, some folks couldn't imagine those lines not getting blurred in a way that would be unethical. And so there was like at least in my understanding, right, there was a administrative regime change when I arrived in Boulder to attend that program. And it went from, of course, you have to touch the body to don't ever touch the body. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't spend years studying something that fundamentally feels out of alignment integration to me. But I decided I was already there. Like I had moved, like literally packed up my life and moved, and rearranged things and did the end of my BA, which would have taken a year in the other program, but took 2 years just because of the way the credits got reallocated, and shifted things to be an interdisciplinary degree in Buddhism, psychology, and the body. And the psychology component was primarily like a Buddhist psychological kind of framework. So I hung out there for a while. And, then other hijinks ensued, which eventually, I'm going to skip a really big section of the story.
How important is the section? Well, I guess actually, let me go back.
It depends on how, it depends on where we want to go with this conversation.
I hear you.
Hold on 1 second. Take my long sleeve shirt off and it was caught in my headphones. Okay, go ahead. Ask
I appreciate
question,
that.
please.
No, you're taking care of your immediate needs. I got a blanket and put on me so I wouldn't be cold and stuff. You got to do that stuff, right?
Yeah, man.
Well, what I was going to say is I think it's interesting. I heard you talking about that. I watched that like panel thing that you sent me, which I really appreciated. And you talked about this like spectrum of, on the one side, like someone's shoulders dislocated, so you have to like adjust it back into place.
Right.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, your hands are just like hovering over someone and you're like summoning Reiki energy or something like that. Or I know that might not be the right way to say that. I apologize to all my Reiki friends out there if I just said a faux pas, but you get my point that there's that kind of spectrum. And I think that what I'm curious about is that it seems like the hands-on thing, like dislocating the shoulder, that's pretty tangible, like you could potentially see that in an X-ray or an MRI or something.
Sure.
But the other side of that spectrum, the like energy side of it, if you will, that can't be measured by those devices or metrics that people rely upon. So it seems like sometimes the energy side gets relegated as like hokum or something because it can't be quantified. And I'm curious because I know you're certified in acupuncture and you've studied, like, I know you're somebody who doesn't just go with one. You like studied a bunch of different one and you compare them and stuff. And I wonder like how much of your pursuits have had anything to do with wanting to have credibility in the eyes of the larger world or not.
So, yeah, that's interesting. I would not say that the pursuits have been driven at any point by looking for credibility with any particular framework or paradigm or orientation. Actually, the part of the story that I was going to skip over, which I will just gesture at, is that while I was at Naropa, I got deeply involved in, I got involved in Buddhist practice and thought I would take refuge, but the person who I was interested in taking refuge with was not empowered to, to give refuge vows. So I was kind of in this holding pattern, because for me, I really wanted it to be with someone that I felt a connection to, because there were a lot of dynamics that didn't feel super good to me. As there can be in any group, especially spiritual and religious groups, right? But I encountered a Brazilian syncretic medicine tradition called the Santo Daime, and ended up becoming very, very deeply involved in that for really about 20 years. And so the reason I bring that up, because it's like we could go down that particular rabbit hole, but I think that it would not serve this conversation. But what's important about it is that during that time, my work was very much primarily in kind of the unseen, in what we would sometimes think of as energy or the animate, or within a spiritist or spiritualist context. A lot of work with mediumship, and I did have healing work that I did during those years, both in private practice and in group context, both as a participant and a co-facilitator, and then at a certain point leading. It's all group work, right? But I was one of the people who led many, many spiritual works for a number of years within the community around here, at least. And so that work was probably like at the extreme of the esoteric in terms of the spectrum that you were talking about. And
let me say
what
something.
I found,
let me interject something before you go on. Let me say first that, just to say, like, people having to reconcile limitations and histories of their teachers is a common conversation we've had on this show. So when you reference that one teacher, many of us listening know exactly what you've had to reckon with, because so many of us have had teachers who've had to face stuff like that with. And I will also just say that it's interesting to know that you had that time in the Daime, because I know you wrote Brazilian spiritual practice, and I was going to ask what that is. And I do have some familiarity. While I haven't done much work there myself, I have some very close friends who were deeply involved. So I have some familiarity with that. And I do think it's actually relevant. We can maybe return there later, because there is something to plant medicine, plant wisdoms, and it does kind of connect to some of these questions, but it can easily go down rabbit holes. So I know what you mean.
Yeah, it just gets really, really specific. It's kind of more what I mean than it, part of, if I'm trying to answer the question with regards to current practice, right? It's relevant insofar as that some people come from a more, I have a lot of colleagues that were in the sciences, or they were engineers and they ended up in Chinese medicine. I also have colleagues that were, into internal martial arts, or, into what they would have called energy work, that ended up in Chinese medicine or traditional East Asian medical practice. So I was more on the side of like being in a pretty esoteric space, and finding that in some respects, what I was looking for was a way not to legitimize that work, but to make it more accessible as a profession, because I was doing other things to support myself that were not nourishing. And so, that thing where like, if you work 40 plus hours a week and you don't like or really, really actively dislike what you do, it doesn't matter what other practices you're doing. If the bulk of your life is situated within something that's not nourishing, it's a really imbalanced and disharmonic way to live. And so I had found myself there because I was doing other things to create the space so that I could focus on spiritual pursuits and inquiries. But I woke up one morning, in quotes, but also literally, and was like, what is going on? I've like become that dude who has a career that he never intended to have and that he hates. And so I decided that I needed to shift my professional life. And the way somehow that I came to see that made the most sense was to go to graduate school for Chinese medicine, because at least what I thought at the time is it was connected in my mind to energy work, but it would somehow increase my scope of practice and be something that I could at least say, well, I do this thing that people would think that they knew what it was, which would then not necessitate an hour-long conversation to try to describe the basics of what it is that I might be able to do with a person. So very long-winded answer.
No, not at all. It's actually very clear, kind of what I was looking for in terms of that idea that you went into Chinese medicine with a background in daime, not necessarily in academia.
Yeah.
Not that you didn't also have some academia study, but that is an experiential basis from which your inquiry comes from, that I do imagine would have shaped how your work has gone or how you see things.
Yeah, it certainly has. And at the same time, what I thought Chinese medicine was, based on the limited amount of experience I had and the work that I had done with one of my teachers in the daime, who was an acupuncturist, I found that it was not that. And that, at least in the way that I was learning it and being trained, like we can talk about it as energy medicine. And, let's be clear, I'm speaking for myself. I'm speaking for the particulars of the contexts within which I have, been and continue to be a student. And it's an entirely, like, Chinese medicine is not a thing, right? It is so heterogeneous.
Well, I wanted to ask you that. You said that in one of those other talks. You said there are no things in Chinese medicine.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Okay, so we'll let me finish this thought and then we'll go there for sure. So just to be clear, right, that you could go talk to 5 other people that also say that they practice Chinese medicine or classical Chinese medicine, or maybe even the same subset of disciplines and traditions within Chinese medicine that I practice, and not have the same conversation, right? So I just want to make that clear, both to folks that aren't familiar with the terrain, and if any of my brothers and sisters and other siblings who are listening, that, I'm making no claims. I'm just talking about my particular relationship to all of this.
Okay, so I'm sorry, but before we go on to the no things, that we still have to stay there, because is that because there's, like, these things are just open to interpretation? Like, you're all certified acupuncturists or whatever. Yeah. How come you guys could be in the same, even like whatever lineage or sect or segment, as you said, and still not see it the same?
Right. So it all depends on what level of resolution and sort of where the rubber meets the road is clinical practice. So there are broad strokes that generally are agreed on. And then, there's quite a long history of the study of the family of medicines that come from the Neijing, which is this sort of the root text of Chinese medicine, and of the other families and branches of traditional East Asian medicine that come from there. I mean, because there's other systems in other countries that don't, like certain kinds of Tibetan medicine, not based in the Neijing. But you could be in Japan or Korea and have systems that are native to those places, but still are rooted back to the classics. So we're not talking about like 100 years or a couple hundred years. We're talking about a couple thousand years potentially of people making inquiries at times of great unrest, right? Of commenting and responding to the context that they were in and the particulars of, what was going on with pandemics, with, how do we deal with injury on the battlefield, with, gynecological concerns and nourishing life practices, right? And all of that stuff is changing based on the where and the when. It's not like that you did this thing once and then that always is the answer, because that view, right, is when we lean back into this kind of reductionist, and this is where we tie into the things piece. Like, if I see the world as a place where there's just like blocks that are bumping into each other, then potentially if I understand the organization of the blocks and the way they're bumping, then I understand everything. But like, that's just one aspect of what's going on. And, it doesn't necessarily give rise to the potential for a skillful relational engagement with this moment, which, if we're going to talk about medicine from at least my understanding of the Chinese medical tradition, it's fundamentally relational and processual. And so I'm not relating to the theory, right? The theory is something that I study to the point, hopefully, where it can become embodied so that it is a way of knowing and communicating so that I can meet, right, in this moment, what's arising, and then find a way to communicate in that moment and in that relational space in such a manner that what emerges is greater coherence, which is what we would call health. Right? Because when we see this thing that we think of as illness, right? And let's be clear, right? The notion of pathology, which there's plenty of that in the Chinese medical canon, but as a practitioner for myself, like, I don't lean into the notion of pathology or illness. I recognize those things as phenomenon that are agreed upon, but at the same time, another way to look at that is, every system is doing the best it can to navigate all of the various contexts and forces, quote within and quote without, right? And what is being expressed in a moment is the story of all of that being told. And if we can learn how to get out of the way enough, like in terms of my own stuff as a person who's there to support someone in a process, if I can get enough of my shit out of the way so that I can be present and have developed through study and practice enough skill to intervene potentially in the simplest, clearest way possible, so that communication then helps that system, which at the moment somehow isn't fully able to access its innate intelligence and wisdom, and thereby to express in this emergent way that we would call health. That conversation, right? That intervention potentially, is the thing, which is not a thing, but the message that allows the system then to be like, oh, right, that's how I do it, right? And so that it's not like I'm healing anybody ever, but I can nudge things in such a way that innate wisdom faculty, that innate intelligence, can then come back into, let's call it an ascendant orientation to the system, so that then things can start to really harmonize and flow and express with vitality in a more full manner.
Well, I mean, I love everything you said. It's beautiful. I guess my curiosity is that, you talk about what sounds to me like a listening that you're doing, on like a lot of different levels. And it sounds like on some level that's a very intuitive process, because it's not like you're following some strict protocol, because the moment is too vibrant in and of itself to be reduced to some sort of standardized protocol. At the same time, I know that in these traditions that you're working within, or I know other people who study acupuncture as well, they have all sorts of like diagnostic techniques and, you're putting needles into people's bodies. And I guess how much of that is like an attempt to affect the material world, the material body, and how much of that is functioning on some other subtle level?
Well, one of the things that, as I was listening to a couple of your conversations, it occurred to me that I wanted to convey, and this seems like a great moment, so thank you for that,
cool.
Is that I feel like often what happens is we play, right, like the apparent dichotomy of a physicalist and an idealist orientation, right? Which certainly in their most naive expressions are absolutely like in this polar relationship, or like there's matter or there's energy. And I'm not suggesting that it's that unnuanced what you're suggesting, but I think that we're really missing a huge amount of space in the midst of it. And it's like just on the level of the body, right? Like there's an incredible level of subtle nuance in terms of what is actually perceptible before we start talking about the subtle body, right? I mean, like the movement of the liver, for instance, it's intrinsic movement, right? And that movement in relationship to not the beat, but the movement.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.